The sun shone brightly over the suburban neighborhood, casting a warm glow on the neatly manicured lawns and rows of perfectly aligned homes. Grace, her wheelchair gliding smoothly over the paved sidewalk, sat beside her mother, a quiet determination in her eyes. The morning air was crisp, and for a brief moment, everything seemed peaceful. They had walked this route countless times, but today was different. Today, they were heading to the HOA office. Grace had a question, simple yet vital, a request for clarification on the neighborhood rules that govern their lives. Her mother, always supportive, had encouraged her to speak up. The HOA was a place where answers should be given, where the rules of the community could be understood. But the moment they stepped into the office, everything shifted. Behind the cold, fluorescent lights of the HOA office stood Karen, a woman whose presence filled the room with an air of superiority and control. As soon as Grace began to speak, asking about the neighborhood's guidelines, Karen's face tightened. Her cold eyes narrowed. And before Grace could finish her sentence, Karen cut her off. "People like you shouldn't be asking about things like that," she snapped, her voice sharp and biting. The hostility in her tone was unmistakable, and it sent an icy chill through the room. Grace froze. Her words caught in her throat as Karen's angry gaze bore down on her. The mother could feel it. Something was off. The calm morning had shattered into something far darker. I never expected it. The icy chill of her gaze was like a warning, a storm about to break. Karen didn't just disagree. She attacked, her tone dripping with disdain and condescension. As Grace and her mother stood there, trying to process the words that had been thrown at them, the atmosphere grew tense, thick with the weight of Karen's animosity. The sense of unease was palpable, and as the door slammed behind Karen, the mother could feel the storm building. This was just the beginning. The confrontation had started, and it was only going to get worse. The inside of Karen's office felt like a cold, sterile cage, its walls lined with harsh fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. There was no warmth here, only the heavy presence of authority and control that Karen exuded effortlessly. As Grace and her mother entered, they felt immediately out of place. The space was barren, save for a few metal filing cabinets and a desk cluttered with papers. Grace's wheelchair barely made a sound on the floor as they approached the desk, but Karen's eyes locked onto them the moment they stepped inside. Without a greeting, Karen stood from her chair, her movements sharp and deliberate. "You need to leave," she said, her voice laced with authority, though there was no kindness behind it. "Now." The coldness in her words hit Grace like a physical blow, and for a moment neither Grace nor her mother could move. There was an intensity in Karen's stare, as though she was daring them to challenge her. "What did we do wrong?" "We just wanted to know about the rules," Grace's mother asked, trying to reason, her voice trembling with confusion. But Karen didn't care to answer. Instead, she waved a dismissive hand, motioning for them to leave. "You're disrupting things. You need to go," she snapped, her tone icy and final. Before Grace's mother could protest, Karen turned toward the back of the office, walking briskly as if she was in full control. The mother hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Grace, who was visibly shaken by the harshness of Karen's words. She wanted to say more, to demand answers, but in that instant, Karen's actions spoke louder than anything she could have said. Without warning, Karen reached out and locked the door. The loud click echoed in the room, sending a chill down both Grace's and her mother's spines. "I'll just put you in here for your own good," Karen said, almost as though it was a kindness. The sound of the lock, each click louder than the last, reverberated through the room, like a final decision made on Grace's fate. For her own good? Grace's mother thought, her mind racing with disbelief. The words didn't make sense. She couldn't fathom why Karen would do such a thing, lock her disabled daughter in a closet. Inside the small, windowless room, Grace was left in the dark. Not just physically, but emotionally, as she tried to process what had just happened. Why was she being punished? What had she done to deserve this? The air felt thick and suffocating, the silence pressing in on her from every direction. The world outside seemed so far away now, and for the first time, Grace felt completely alone, unsure of what was happening or why she was being forced to endure it. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was nothing she could do but sit there, waiting for anyone, to come and explain this nightmare. The mother stood in shock for a moment, staring at the locked door in disbelief. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. How had they gone from simply asking a question about the neighborhood rules to this? It didn't make sense. She had expected a friendly discussion, a simple exchange of information, nothing like this. But now, standing in the sterile office, she was faced with a terrifying reality. Her daughter was locked away in that tiny room, alone and vulnerable. The mother's mind raced, and a sickening feeling crept up her spine. She had always known the HOA was a place of rules and regulations, but she had never encountered this kind of cruelty. Karen's eyes had been so cold, so calculating. There was no remorse in them, just a chilling sense of authority. It was as if Karen had been waiting for an opportunity to lash out, and now she had found it. "Let me in," the mother demanded, her voice shaking as she stepped toward the door. But there was no answer. She pounded her fists against the cold metal, hoping that Karen would relent, that someone would hear her and let Grace out. But nothing, only silence. Her heart twisted in her chest as she imagined Grace sitting in the dark, alone, frightened. "Please, Grace, are you okay?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The fear in her voice was palpable, but there was no response from the other side of the door. She could feel her legs weakening beneath her as the realization set in. She was powerless. The mother stepped back, staring at the locked door. The walls seemed to close in around her. She could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning, but it felt like the world had gone still, like time itself had stopped. It was then that it hit her. Karen wasn't just a person. She was a symbol of the system that didn't care about people like Grace, people with disabilities, people who didn't fit into her perfect world. And in that moment, the mother knew this wasn't just about a misunderstanding, it was about power, control, and cruelty. "I have to get her out of here," the mother whispered fiercely to herself, her voice filled with determination. She turned toward the hallway, looking around for anyone who could help. There was no one. Karen had made sure of that. The office was deserted, the quiet unnerving. The mother's stomach churned, and for a brief moment, she wondered if anyone would believe her if she went to the authorities. Would they take her seriously? Would they see Grace as a victim? Or would they brush her off as just another complaint? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound from behind the door, a slight shuffle, a soft breath. It was barely audible, but it was enough to send a wave of relief through her. Grace was still there, still alive. The mother took a deep breath, but the knot in her stomach remained. She needed to get Grace out. She couldn't leave her there, locked away, like some criminal, especially not for simply asking about the rules. But how? As the mother paced back and forth in front of a locked door, her mind raced for answers. What could she do? What was the next step? Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint click of a distant door opening, the sound of footsteps approaching. It wasn't Karen, though, it was something else. Maybe help was coming. Maybe there was still a chance to get Grace out. The footsteps grew louder, and for a moment, the mother's heart leapt in her chest, hoping that someone was finally coming to her aid. But when the door to the office opened, it was Karen who stepped into the hallway. Her expression was impassive, almost smug, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just locked a disabled girl in a closet for asking a simple question. The mother's heart sank, but she stood her ground, refusing to back down. "You need to let my daughter out right now." The mother's voice was firm, but her hands trembled at her sides. Her desperation was raw, and she could feel the walls closing in again, the air thick with the weight of Karen's indifference. Karen didn't flinch. She stood in the doorway, blocking the way, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. "She's fine," Karen said coldly, her voice almost dismissive. "She's not hurt. She's just being difficult. Sometimes, people like her need to be put in their place." The words struck the mother like a slap to the face. "People like her," she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "What does that even mean?" You locked her in a closet like she was some criminal. Karen's eyes narrowed, her face hardening. You don't understand, she said, her voice lowering to a dangerous, almost condescending tone. Rules are rules, and not everyone is meant to be here. She was disturbing the peace, and I had every right to do what I did. You should be thanking me. A sickening chill ran down the mother's spine as Karen's words sunk in. It wasn't just about power, it was about control, about superiority. Karen wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was justifying it, hiding behind her own twisted logic. The mother's stomach churned with anger and disbelief. Thank you. The mother spat, her voice thick with venom. You're telling me that locking a defenseless, disabled child in a closet is something I should thank you for? Her breath came out in ragged gasps as she took a step toward Karen. You're a monster. Karen didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, studying the mother with an almost eerie calmness. You're welcome to try and make a scene, but no one will believe you. You're just a mother making a fuss. The HOA has rules. If you want to stay here, you'll follow them. If you don't, then you can leave. You and your daughter are no different from the rest, but people like you. Karen's lip curled slightly. You're nothing but a nuisance, and nuisances get dealt with. The mother's chest tightened with anger, her hands balling into fists. She had heard enough. She was no longer going to let Karen's words control the situation. She had to fight back. For Grace. For herself. She couldn't let this woman get away with what she had done. I'll take this to the authorities. I'll make sure everyone knows what you did to my daughter, the mother declared, her voice trembling with fury but laced with determination. This isn't over. You're not going to get away with this. Karen's lips twisted into a cruel smile. You can try, but good luck. The HOA is a powerful organization. I have the support of the community. No one will believe you over me. You're just a mother with a broken child. The mother's hands shook, but she stood tall. She would not let Karen's words break her. She had nothing left to lose. I don't care, she said, her voice steady now. I'll make sure the truth comes out. You'll pay for what you did. Karen shrugged indifferently, as though dismissing the mother's threat. Do what you want. But remember, you're the one causing a scene, not me. And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing down the hallway, leaving the mother alone, seething with rage and disbelief. As the sound of Karen's footsteps faded, the mother's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about Grace anymore. This was about exposing Karen's cruelty, about standing up for what was right. The fight was far from over. The war had only just begun, and the mother was ready to do whatever it took to bring Karen to justice. The mother stood in the empty hallway, her fists clenched at her sides, the echo of Karen's footsteps still ringing in her ears. She had been dismissed, belittled, and threatened, but the fire inside her burned brighter than ever. Grace's image flashed in her mind, locked away in that closet, and the sheer cruelty of it sent a surge of anger through her chest. Every breath she took felt like a reminder of what had just happened, and she couldn't let it go. Not now. Not ever. She turned, her mind racing with options. Should she go to the police? Or would they just brush her off, too? Would they even believe her over Karen? Her thoughts whirled in a storm of confusion and fury, but one thing was certain, this wasn't just about breaking the rules. This was about Grace's dignity, her safety, and her rights. And she wouldn't stand by and let Karen get away with it. With newfound determination, the mother stormed back toward Karen's office. But when she reached the door, her hand froze on the handle. For a split second, she wondered if this was the right thing to do. Could she handle the backlash? Could she expose Karen without making things worse? But then she thought of Grace. How scared and alone she must have been behind that door. No, she couldn't back down. Not now. The door swung open, and the mother stepped inside, her eyes locking with Karen's. The woman was sitting behind her desk, casually flipping through some papers, as though nothing had happened. But the mother wasn't fooled. She could see the smug satisfaction in Karen's eyes. She could feel it, the sense of superiority that radiated off her. Let her out, the mother demanded, her voice steady but fierce. "You can lock her in a closet all you want, but you're not getting away with it." Karen didn't even look up. "I've already told you she's fine," she said, her tone dismissive. "I'm doing what's best for this community. You're just overreacting." The mother took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice low but deadly serious. "You're not in charge of my daughter. You don't have the right to lock her away like some kind of prisoner just because you don't like her. This is about power, Karen. You're abusing it, and I'm not going to let you." Karen's eyes finally met hers, but there was no remorse there. Only coldness. "You think you're going to make a difference? You're just a mother. People like you don't get to dictate how things work around here." The words hit the mother like a slap. "I'm not just a mother," she spat, her chest tightening with rage. "I'm a mother who's going to make sure the world knows what you did. And I will not stop until Grace is safe. I'll take this to every media outlet, every lawyer, every person who will listen. This ends now." Karen's eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe, or was it just frustration? But she quickly masked it with a mocking laugh. "You can try, but nobody will believe you. You're just some woman who thinks she knows better. No one cares about your little crusade." But the mother wasn't backing down. "You're wrong. People care. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. You're going to regret this." Karen's face twisted into a snarl. But before she could say anything else, the door behind her swung open. The mother turned, startled, as a voice called out from the doorway. "What's going on here?" A man stepped into the room. A lawyer, the mother realized. He was tall, with dark hair and a stern expression, but there was something comforting about his presence. He was a stranger. Yet in that moment, he felt like her only ally. "Nothing that concerns you," Karen said, her voice sharp and dismissive. But the lawyer didn't flinch. "I'm afraid it does concern me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This seems like a matter for the legal team. I'm representing this woman, and I'm advising you to let her daughter go. Now." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just waltz in here and tell me what to do?" "I don't think. I know," the lawyer replied, stepping forward and placing a firm hand on the desk. "This is a violation of civil rights. You've crossed the line, Karen, and it's going to cost you." The tension in the room was palpable as the lawyer's words sank in. For the first time, Karen seemed to hesitate. The smug confidence that had once marked her demeanor was now replaced with a flicker of uncertainty. The power that she had so easily wielded over the mother just moments ago was slipping away. "Let her go," the lawyer repeated, his tone unyielding. Karen sat frozen, her eyes darting between the mother and the lawyer. The mother's heart raced as she felt the weight of the moment, the balance tipping, the battle shifting in her favor. Finally, Karen stood. "Fine," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think you've won? You haven't. This isn't over." But the mother wasn't listening anymore. She watched as Grace was released from the closet, her face pale, but relieved. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The victory wasn't in the confrontation or the words spoken, it was in Grace's freedom. The minutes dragged on, and the mother stood frozen in the hallway, her mind racing. She could still hear the faint echo of Karen's words in her ears, like an ugly refrain that refused to leave. "You're just a mother with a broken child." That line, that cruelty, stung more deeply than any physical blow. It wasn't just about Grace being locked in the closet anymore. It was about the realization that Karen saw them as nothing more than an inconvenience, a nuisance. And that was a line the mother couldn't and wouldn't let slide. A surge of determination coursed through her veins as she paced back and forth in front of the locked door. She wasn't going to stand by and let Karen destroy everything they had worked for. This was more than a fight for justice. It was a fight for dignity, for the respect that they both deserved. No one should be treated this way, least of all Grace, who had done nothing but ask a simple question. The sound of a distant knock at the door startled the mother, breaking her from her thoughts. She rushed forward, her pulse quickening. "Grace," she called softly, "are you okay?" There was no answer, just the faint sound of shuffling behind the locked door. The silence was unbearable. The mother's throat tightened as her mind raced, imagining the worst. What if Grace was hurt? What if she was too scared to respond? The fear of what might be happening to her daughter on the other side of that door was almost suffocating. She raised her hand to the door, pressing her palm flat against the cold metal. "Grace," she whispered again, her voice breaking, "please answer me." For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. But then, just as the mother began to lose hope, a soft, trembling voice came through the door. I'm here, Mom. I'm scared." The words were weak, fragile, and they shattered the mother's resolve like glass. A wave of relief flooded over her, but it was quickly replaced by a searing rage. Karen had done this. She had taken a vulnerable child and locked her away for nothing more than asking a simple question. The thought of what Grace must have felt, sitting there alone and afraid, tore at the mother's heart. The mother's breath was ragged as she stepped back, her mind racing. She couldn't waste any more time. Grace needed to get out of there now. The mother turned toward the hallway, her eyes scanning for anything that could help. Her fingers gripped the railing, her nails digging into the metal. She couldn't back down. Not now. With one final deep breath, the mother raised her fist and pounded on the door, the sound ringing through the empty hallway. "Karen," she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "You let my daughter out. Now." There was no response. The hallway remained eerily silent, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. The mother's heart pounded, but she couldn't give up. Not when Grace was on the other side of that door, vulnerable and alone. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the door clicked. The lock turned slowly, and with a creak, it swung open. Grace was sitting on the floor, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up at her mother with tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to upset anyone." The mother's heart broke as she knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a tight hug. "Shoo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." But even as she held Grace close, the anger still burned inside her. Karen had crossed a line. She had taken away Grace's sense of safety, of security, and for that, she would never be forgiven. The mother looked down at her daughter, her mind made up. "We're leaving," she said, her voice firm. "We're not staying here. Not after what she did to you." Grace looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with confusion and sadness. "What do you mean?" The mother's eyes hardened. "We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Karen will pay for what she did." With that, the mother helped Grace to her feet, and together they walked out of the office, leaving the scene behind. But as they stepped into the bright sunlight, the mother knew this was only the beginning. The battle for justice, for Grace's dignity, was far from over, and she would fight for as long as it took to make sure no one else would ever have to suffer like they had. The following days felt like a blur of adrenaline, disbelief, and raw determination. The mother couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, as the events of the past few days replayed over and over in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Grace, locked in that closet, helpless and afraid. It was as though the image was seared into her memory, a constant reminder of the cruelty that had been inflicted on her daughter. But there was no time for tears now. There was no time to wallow in the pain. It was time to take action. The first step was reaching out to a lawyer. She knew the legal battle wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't fight this on her own. The HOA was a powerful institution, and Karen had the support of the community behind her. But the mother was ready to face that fight head-on. For Grace, for justice, she spent hours on the phone, searching for the best lawyer who could help them take on the HOA. The process was slow, frustrating, and filled with dead ends, but she refused to give up. She wasn't going to let Karen's abuse go unchecked. The more she learned about her rights, the more fired up she became. Karen had broken the law, violated Grace's rights, and the mother wasn't going to let her get away with it. One afternoon, as the mother sat at the kitchen table, sifting through legal documents, She received a call from the lawyer she'd been in touch with. He'd agreed to take their case. The relief that washed over her was overwhelming, but she knew that this was just the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, and she couldn't afford to lose her focus now. The lawyer promised to gather evidence, to track down witnesses, and to build a case that would expose Karen's actions. But the mother knew she couldn't wait for the legal system to catch up. She had to take control of this situation herself. She began documenting everything, taking photos of the HOA building, collecting any potential evidence, writing down every word Karen had said to her and Grace. Every detail mattered. She knew the more they had, the stronger their case would be. In the meantime, she contacted local news outlets, hoping to raise awareness about what had happened. She wasn't just fighting for Grace anymore. She was fighting for every disabled person who had ever been mistreated or neglected by an oppressive system. She wanted to make sure that no other child would have to face what Grace had faced. It was a fight for change, a fight for the future. But as the media began to catch wind of the story, the pressure mounted. Some people supported her, but others, especially members of the HOA, tried to silence her. They accused her of making a spectacle out of nothing, of exaggerating the situation. The backlash was swift and cruel. The mother was called every name in the book: drama queen, attention seeker, unfit mother. It was as if the community rallied behind Karen, unwilling to accept that one of their own could have done something so horrendous. The mother felt the weight of their judgment, but it only fueled her resolve. She wouldn't stop. Not now. Then, one day, she received an anonymous tip. A former HOA employee had reached out, offering a piece of critical information. Karen had a history of abusing her position, manipulating people to get her way. It wasn't just Grace. The former employee claimed that Karen had locked other residents out of meetings, dismissed valid complaints, and made a habit of bullying anyone who dared challenge her authority. The mother's heart raced as she realized they had more than just their word against Karen's. With this new information, the mother met with her lawyer again, her resolve stronger than ever. They began preparing for a legal showdown with the HOA. The lawyer was optimistic, and the mother felt a surge of hope. But she knew better than to get too comfortable. Karen was powerful, and the HOA was a deeply entrenched institution. They wouldn't give up without a fight. The mother pushed forward, all the while ensuring Grace felt supported. Grace's bravery had been the catalyst for this entire journey. She had stood up for herself, even when it meant facing the unimaginable. It was time for the mother to do the same. Together, they would confront the power that had tried to crush them. As the weeks passed, the pressure continued to mount. News reports covered the case, interviews with other victims surfaced, and the truth about Karen's abusive behavior started to leak out. The community was divided, but slowly the tide was beginning to turn. More people began to question the HOA's practices. More people started to speak out, and Karen's once unshakable power began to crack. The mother, empowered by the support of her lawyer and the growing number of people behind her, knew the battle was far from over. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like they had a fighting chance. She had taken control. She had refused to back down. And no matter what happened next, she would continue to fight for Grace and for the justice they both deserved. This was just the beginning. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the rustling of the audience in their seats. The air felt thick with anticipation as the judge entered, his robe sweeping the floor, his eyes scanning the room with an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. The mother sat in the front row, her heart pounding in her chest, but her resolve stronger than ever. She had been fighting this battle for weeks, and now it was finally time for justice to be served. Grace sat beside her, her small hands trembling but her eyes steady, filled with a quiet strength. It had been a long journey for them both, and the weight of what was at stake loomed over them. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of interviews, meetings with the lawyer, and tense discussions with the media. But now, they had reached the moment of truth. Karen, sitting on the other side of the courtroom, appeared unfazed, her lips curling into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. Her confidence was unshaken, her posture straight and rigid, as though she were above it all. The mother felt a surge of anger. The audacity of Karen to sit there, acting as though nothing had happened, was infuriating. But she knew she had to remain focused. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure that no one else would ever have to face the same cruelty Grace had endured. This was about holding Karen accountable for her actions, for locking her daughter away, for abusing her power, and for causing emotional trauma that would last far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The trial began with opening statements, and the mother could barely contain her frustration as Karen's lawyer spun the narrative, painting Grace as a disruptive force who had been the real instigator of the incident. The lawyer twisted the facts, trying to discredit the mother's version of events, claiming that Karen had merely acted in the best interest of the community. It was as if Karen's actions were justified, as though Grace's presence in the office had somehow warranted her being locked away. The mother felt her blood boil, but she stayed silent, focusing on the goal. Then it was the mother's turn to speak. She stood up, her legs slightly trembling, but her voice was clear and firm as she recounted the events that had led up to that fateful day. She spoke of Grace's simple question, of the hostility that had been directed toward them, and of the moment when Karen had locked Grace in the closet. She described the fear in Grace's eyes when she had found her daughter alone and terrified, trapped in a dark room with no explanation. She spoke of the weeks of pain, the sleepless nights, and the heartbreak that followed. Every word she spoke was backed by evidence, photos, witness testimonies, the anonymous tip about Karen's history of abuse. It was a mountain of evidence that Karen couldn't ignore, no matter how hard her lawyer tried to discredit it. The mother could feel the tide turning in her favor as the audience listened intently, the weight of the truth settling in the room like a heavy stone. Karen's defense began to crumble as the mother's lawyer presented the damning evidence. The former HOA employee testified about Karen's manipulation of her position, recounting incidents where Karen had bullied residents and ignored legitimate complaints. The lawyer painted a picture of a woman who had abused her power, using her position for personal gain, and who had taken advantage of Grace's vulnerability. As the courtroom tension thickened, the judge called for a brief recess. The mother sat in her seat, her fingers clenched tightly together as she glanced at Grace. Her daughter's face was filled with quiet resilience, her gaze fixed ahead, and the mother could see the subtle shift in her eyes, the glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they were going to win this fight. During the recess, Karen's lawyer approached the mother's lawyer, whispering urgently, perhaps sensing that the tide had indeed turned. The deal they proposed was shocking. In exchange for dropping the case, they would offer a financial settlement. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. They wanted to silence the mother and Grace, to keep this from going public, to bury the truth once again. The mother's lawyer, ever the professional, rejected the offer without hesitation. This wasn't about money, it was about justice, and it wasn't for sale. The judge returned, and the closing statements began. The mother listened carefully as Karen's lawyer tried one last time to defend Karen's actions, but it was clear to everyone in the room that the defense had lost its footing. The evidence was too overwhelming, and the truth too powerful. When it was the mother's turn to give her closing statement, she spoke from the heart, not reading from a script, but allowing her raw emotion to fuel her words. Justice isn't just about punishment, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. My daughter didn't deserve to be treated like this. She didn't deserve to be locked away, to be made to feel less than. No one should ever be treated this way. And I will not let this woman or anyone else get away with it. We are not just fighting for Grace. We are fighting for every single person who has ever been silenced, who has been mistreated, who has been told that they don't matter. The courtroom was silent as the judge called for a final deliberation. Moments later, the verdict was delivered. Karen was found guilty of abuse of power, and the HOA was ordered to pay restitution for the emotional distress caused to Grace. The mother felt a surge of relief, a weight lifted from her shoulders. She had done it. They had done it. Justice had been served. Karen would face the consequences of her actions, and Grace would no longer be a victim of her cruelty. As they left the courtroom, the mother looked down at Grace, who was smiling up at her. It was a small smile, but it was enough. It was a symbol of victory, of strength, and of the bond they shared. The battle had been hard, but the mother knew they had won. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, everything would be okay. But as she stepped out into the sunlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and she would be ready to face whatever came next for Grace and for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. The weeks following the courtroom victory were a whirlwind of media attention and public scrutiny. The story of Grace's ordeal had caught the attention of people across the country, sparking debates about the treatment of people with disabilities, the abuse of power within community organizations, and the lengths to which a mother would go to protect her child. While the mother felt a sense of accomplishment, she also knew that the journey wasn't truly over. They had won the battle, but the war for justice, for a better world, was ongoing. Karen's defeat had far-reaching consequences. The HOA, which had once stood by her, now found itself in the midst of a public relations nightmare. They had been forced to issue a public apology, a rare and humiliating move for such an institution. The local community that had once quietly allowed Karen to exert her control over them now had to reckon with the reality of her actions. The mother, however, wasn't content with just a public apology. She wanted change. She wanted to make sure this didn't happen again. In the aftermath, the mother began working with local advocacy groups, using the attention the case had generated to bring awareness to the systemic issues within the HOA and similar organizations. She became an outspoken advocate for the rights of people with disabilities, speaking at conferences, meeting with lawmakers, and appearing on national news to ensure that the voices of those who had been silenced were finally heard. But despite the public victories, the emotional scars from what had happened still lingered. Grace had recovered physically from the trauma, but emotionally, it was clear that the experience had left its mark. She was more cautious now, more reserved, and sometimes the nightmares would return, making her relive those dark moments in the closet. The mother knew that healing wasn't a simple process. It would take time, love, and the constant assurance that she would always protect her. One evening, as the sun set behind their house, the mother sat with Grace in the living room, looking through photos of the past few months. There were images from the courtroom, from the news interviews, and even a few from the moments just after the verdict was announced, where Grace's smile, though small, had been genuine. As they looked at the photos together, Grace turned to her mother, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "You really did it, didn't you?" Grace said, her eyes shining with admiration. "You fought for me, for us." The mother smiled and pulled Grace closer, kissing the top of her head. "We fought together, baby. You were the one who made me fight. You stood up for yourself when no one else would, and that made me believe we could win." Grace nodded, her hand resting on her mother's arm, a feeling of peace settling over her. She was no longer the scared child locked away in a dark closet. She was strong, stronger than she had ever realized, and she knew her mother would always be there by her side, fighting for her. The mother's phone rang, breaking the silence. It was the lawyer calling to update her on the latest developments. As the mother listened, she felt a sense of resolve settle over her once more. There would always be more battles to fight. There would always be people who tried to exploit their positions of power. But as long as they stood together, as long as they remembered the lessons they had learned, they would keep fighting. "We've got more work to do," the mother said, hanging up the phone with a determined look on her face. Grace turned to her, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I know, but I'm ready." And in that moment, the mother realized that they had both come out of this stronger than ever. They had faced the darkest parts of human nature, the cruelty, the indifference, and had come out victorious. They had done it together, not just as mother and daughter, but as warriors, as survivors. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they had already proven that nothing could break them. The mother glanced out the window, watching as the stars began to appear in the sky. She felt a sense of peace settle over her. Finally, after everything that had happened, they had endured the worst, and now they were ready to move forward. As the night grew deeper, the mother took Grace's hand in hers, and they both stood up, looking out at the horizon. They had won. The world was theirs to reclaim, and they wouldn't let anyone take it away again. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The fight for justice, for a better world where people like Grace were no longer silenced, was far from finished. But they would keep fighting. Together. Always.